we go. So, Perth, Hollywood, Westminster, Brussels, where should power lie? So, I thought we'd start by having a think about what exactly is power. And I'm sure you can define it in lots of different ways. I'm saying it's the right or the responsibility to do something, but it's also having the resources available to do that thing. And finally, because we're talking about political entities, what democratic legitimacy do these various groups have? Because that seems to me to be quite important. But I will also talk about some non-governmental groups who plainly do have some power. So, starting with Perth and Kinross Council, I got most of this, all of this, from the front page of the website, and it's not a complete list. But I think it's fairly reasonable to say that Perth and Kinross Council actually do most of the things that matter to us in our day-to-day lives. They're responsible for nearly all those things. So in a way, they're quite a powerful body. However, if we look at the resources, I'm sure you can't actually read all this, but the red block is the general revenue grant that comes from Hollywood. The pale blue comes from council tax, which is closely controlled by Hollywood. The green is the non-domestic rates, the business rates, pretty much controlled outside Perth and Kinross, which leaves a little bit at the end. So what I'm saying is, Perth and Kinross Council has a lot of power to impact our lives, but it has very little control over the resources available to it. Now that might seem quite gloomy, because in fact we know that the responsibilities of Perth and Kinross Council, education, care of the elderly, and many other things, actually consumes lots of the resources available there, which may leave very little wiggle room within that. It's not quite true. We know, for example, and these are the things I happen to know a little bit about, that if you like, how you deploy educational psychologists is within the remit of Perth and Kinross Council. And we know that in the past there was debate about music camps. Again, that's something that Perth and Kinross Council can choose to do or not to do. And finally, it's worth saying that the general revenue grant is obviously set by the government and based partly on needs, and I suspect that Perth and Kinross may get slightly less on a per capita basis than some of the poorer councils, perhaps Dundee and central Glasgow, for fairly obvious reasons. Certainly in England, where the Westminster government does the same thing, there's plainly quite a lot of politicking goes on, because at the moment, since 2010, Liverpool and places like that have had their grants cut dramatically, and Dorset has got away quite lightly. Fairly confident that reverse was the position between 1997 and 2010, because it's within the ambit of the government, be it Westminster or Hollywood, to determine which councils get what. Democratic legitimacy. Perth and Kinross Council is voted for by first past the post, and I'm sure all the people involved in the Perth South by-election are eagerly trying to work out how that works with a by-election for one seat. It's generally accepted as being
STV.
I think you meant to say single transferable vote.
Yes,
You said first past post is STV.
you said FT, first past the post, you mean STV.
What did I say?
You said first past the post.
Okay.
It's single transferable vote.
I knew what I was talking about.
It says up there.
Yeah.
Wasn't it that one? Go on.
But yeah, it's generally accepted as representing the wishes of the electorate most effectively. In terms of democratic legitimacy, the unfortunate thing is the turnout is quite low. And maybe that's because people increasingly see that it doesn't really matter, because the real power is up in the parliaments. So we move on to Hollywood, and if you like, the things that Perth and Kinross don't do that matter to our daily lives, by and large dealt with by Hollywood. Does that seem reasonable to most of you? It does seem to me that between Perth and Kinross and Hollywood, all the things that actually affect us on a day-to-day basis are dealt with in one of those two places. And if we look at the resources, this came from the Scottish Government budget for this year. The vast majority, the blue, comes from the UK Treasury. Small amount, and this will change slightly, and I'm pleased to see we're now talking about raising taxes, which seems to be an overdue requirement, which perhaps slightly increased the benefit of that. So nonetheless, the vast majority of the Hollywood budget comes from Westminster. In terms of democratic legitimacy, it's elected by the additional member system, so it's partly first past the post, but to make sure it's as representative as possible, there's regional lists which add up so that theoretically you end up with a fairly good spread. It's not quite as good as STV, but I think it's probably slightly easier to understand. And lots of other countries use variations of the system. Germany, for example, just had an election and they basically use the same kind of system. There are quite a lot of other people who've got power. And I've just listed them. This was pretty much a brain dump. I'm sure all of you could think of many others within that. I just thought, Historic Scotland down there, second from the bottom, they stopped Perth and Kinross Council from knocking down City Hall. Aviva, who I used to work for, currently employ about 1,200 people in Perth. When it was the world headquarters of General Accident 20 years ago, it was actually slightly fewer. But on the other hand, the average salary is probably then, in today's terms, probably 2 to 3 times higher than what Aviva currently pays. So Aviva has the power to influence Perth and Kinross's economy by whether it chooses to keep the office open in Perth or, as it is at the moment, slightly expanding it. Landowners. We were at a presentation last week where Jim Fairley was talking about the fact he works for the Mansfield estate. Now, I don't know how good the landowner of the Mansfield estate is or not, but we do know that further north in the islands, the landowners have huge power and quite often use it quite badly. And finally, I put the Ganachie Trust down there, obviously a worthy institution, but a charity, and they have some power. So their trustees have some power about what grants go where. So all these groups, and I'm sure you could all think, as many as I put up there, without overlapping that list at all. Moving on to Westminster, so what are they responsible for? Defence and foreign relations, sadly including the EU, immigration, lots of welfare, although some of that's now coming to Hollywood, drugs policy, and lots of other things. Somewhat bizarrely, Westminster also does for England exactly what Hollywood does for Scotland. Now, this issue has been known as the West Lothian question. It's now called evil, which is evil, because it's ridiculous to pretend that Westminster could also be the English Parliament. To make it equal, you need to have an English Parliament with equivalent power to Hollywood, but that's not even anywhere near the agenda. But most importantly, Westminster controls the money. I wrote that originally, and I forgot to change it. It's 25 times, not 30 times. But nonetheless, given that Scotland is, I don't know, the UK is about 12 times as big as Scotland in terms of population, 25 times the budget. It does tell you something, doesn't it? And democratic legitimacy. We know it's elected by first past the post. And I believe that no UK government in my lifetime, and I'm 65, has ever had the majority of the popular vote. Effectively, who governs is decided by a small number of people who swing vote in marginal constituencies, maybe 50 constituencies, maybe 100, but 2,000 or 3,000 people. So out of an electorate of many, many millions, we're talking about 200,000 or 300,000 people who decide who we're going to be governed by. And all the things that have happened in my lifetime, be it Brexit referendum, the Iraq War, privatisations, and going back whatever it was, were decided by government who had not been elected by the majority of the population. And the way things work, if a Prime Minister has an adequate majority, which I'm pleased to say is not the current position, they're effectively a dictator. So Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair were pretty close to being dictators, which is a bit scary, I think. Moving on to the European Union, Brussels. This is again very simplified. This actually comes from their website. They call them competencies as they mean powers. It's probably worth thinking about why the European Union was formed. Essentially, in response to the awfulness of the wars of the first half of the 20th century and some way of trying to avoid it ever happening again. And it built around the idea that if people trade with each other, they're less likely to fight with each other. So we currently are in the biggest free trade organisation anywhere. We're trying to come out at the moment, or some people are trying to come out, but we're in there. And to hear some of the Brexit going on, it seems to me they think all this means is that there's no tariffs. And I think what the European Union has taught us is that trade is much more complex than just about tariffs and quotas. It's about making sure you have a level playing field. And once you realise you have to have a level playing field, you have things like labour issues, environmental issues and so on. Agriculture and fisheries, I suspect this is one of these legacy things. We think back to when the EU was formed in the 1950s. It seemed really important to make sure, after all the horrendous things that happened quite recently, that we were able to feed people. So agriculture and fisheries became far more important. It's probably less important now, but still consumes a lot of the budget. As well as the ones where they have powers, they also provide support through their funding for a variety of things. And Susanna and I have been busy trying to take photographs of things in Scotland that have been funded by the EU. When Jill and I were up on the west coast of Scotland earlier this year, we saw loads of things funded by the European Union. So they do lots of things of that sort. To hear some of the Brexiteers going on, we're run by the European Commission. The European Commission is the civil service. The European Union is actually run jointly by Parliament, elected, and Council of Ministers of elected politicians. Parliament is elected from regional lists, so again it's proportional. And we unfortunately has had very low turnout, and part of that reason explains why Scotland currently has, to its shame, a UKIP MEP. And finally, I don't know if you can read this or not, I shall read it out to you. This is by James Carville, who was an advisor to Bill Clinton. I used to think if there was reincarnation, I wanted to come back as the President or the Pope or a .400 baseball hitter. I think a .400 baseball hitter is damn good. But now I want to come back as the bond market. You can intimidate anyone. So that just shows you that whatever we think, whatever we say that countries have power, actually, things like the bond markets have a lot more power, and it's completely undemocratic. And then Rupert Murdoch, a foreigner, said, when I go to Brussels, they ignore me. In Whitehall, they do as I ask. Scary stuff. And finally, I love this. It's not really relevant, but I loved it. This is also by James Carville. When I found the first quote, I found this one. Republicans, for which we mean far-right people, want smaller government for the same reason crooks want cops. It's easier to get away with murder.
Little anecdotes to begin with. One funny and humorous, and one absolutely serious about Europe. Three actually. I was digging out when we came to the Stay In, the Remain campaign. I dug in the garage to find my European flag to find out it didn't have the right number of stars on it. I've had it so long, it's about 20 years old. So that's a lineage. But going back in that time, one of the events I remember of the referendum for getting into Europe properly was we had a shop in George Street, and this shop was quite a grand shop. We got a loan of it for a month, and we had posters up and all the usual stuff. And Willie Whitelaw came up to open it. I think you'll maybe remember. And I remember the story about the man, and I think he would be burling in his grave now if he knew the shenanigans that are going on. But two things that struck me most of him: he was very, very tall, extremely tall, and he was a complete gentleman, because with him was one of the staff from Mission Control or Tory Headquarters, or whatever you call it, in Edinburgh. And Willie had a cultured accent, but this guy was awfully plummy, and he kept saying, "Mr. Whitelaw, we're in a hurry. And we were hurrying away from the shop, and he said, "I'll need to go," when a tiny wee wifey came along George Street, a tiny little person, and could you stand up a moment, Andrew? Just want to...
I always do as Willie says, yeah.
She did this to him.
He's the deputy provost and father of the house.
Did this to him, sort of. I said, right, okay, thank you. Thank you. And he looked down and he said, "Hello." And she said something to him, and you could see the floppy disk going down pretty rapidly, and suddenly his face lit up. He said, "Oh, hello, Jeannie," or Marjorie, or whatever her name was. And of course the guy from HQ was then purple by this time, because they should have been in the car and halfway across the Franklin Bridge or something. And what he said, I remember this, and this was struck me about him being very tall and being a gentleman. He said to the staffer, "You go away and stand along there. This lady is important to me, and I want to speak to her." And I thought, gee whiz, you are some real guy. And he spent 5 minutes chatting to the lady. And you know what she said at the end? "Thank you so much for stopping to speak to me." Now, the reason I'm telling you that funny little story is, where does power lie? And it lies in the people. It lies in us as individuals. And we sometimes forget about that. We think of systems, we think of structures, and we don't think of people. My other story is much more up to date. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a very strong European. On the 12th of October this year, I stood at 2 o'clock in the afternoon at Tynecourt Cemetery in Passchendaele. 100 years ago to that day, my paternal grandfather went out on a patrol in the army at some point early in the morning and was never ever seen again. He'd simply vanished, along with the other guys who were in the patrol. Presumed dead after so many days, the obituary in the Scotsman. And the temperature that day was about 18 to 19 degrees centigrade. There was a butterfly flew past. There was a bee buzzing round the rose bushes near some of the graves. I don't know if you've ever been. You ought to put it on your bucket list for the same reasons as some folk go to Auschwitz. 11,000 graves. 11,000 of the known buried. And 35,000 names on tablets twice the size of that wall by regiment. And Andrew, sorry, you've heard this story before, and I apologise for repeating it. But, and that, just the feeling of peace, of security, and the contrast between the hellhole that my grandpa died in and that lovely day when David, our older son, and myself were there, was very stark. And again, I come back to, where does power lie? We as individuals have power, and we have influence, and we need to exercise it. Now, that's all the sort of personal bit. What I want to do is say a couple of things about all the referendums so far we've had recently have been quite acrimonious and they're quite divisive. And I'm kind of in a healing process in that regard, because I think there's a danger in them continuing to erode some families, personalities, connections, etc., in a way that I think is corrosive. So I think we need to begin to broaden our minds about alternatives. And where does power lie? I think we should still be in Europe, and I'm still hopeful, we were saying earlier, I'm still hopeful that Vince Cable's plan B or plan C for it all just falling over and us saying, well, let's just go back to mother. It was an awful lot better than all the alternatives will come to pass. And I'm still hopeful that is, because once you begin to unpick the whole process, you find out, and we were talking earlier about farm payments, we were talking about Euratom, like Vince Cable mentioned that, the Erasmus scheme. There's so many different little bits of the thing that once you start to think, how do you replace that? Do you replace it with a lookalike or some pseudotype or whatever? Now, I know I'm talking mostly to converted folk in the room, but I want to introduce you to something that's often discussed but never discussed in any detail, and that's the concept of federalism, because I think it begins to solve some of the issues that Andrew raised. It doesn't solve them all. I don't think any particular government system does. First of all, federalism is based around the power of the people, right? It's based around the power of the people to make a decision, because instead of being a top-down system, it decides that the people who are in what let's call a nation state, right? Okay? Whether it be Wales, Scotland, England, or whatever, Northern Ireland, make a decision. And they make a decision about what power they want to give to somebody else, not what power they get from somebody else. The devolution is all about devolving power from Westminster, but not about people in Scotland or Wales, or England for that matter, saying, we think that there can be a sharing of power with others. And an example of sharing of power could be foreign affairs, it could be defence, it could be something about a customs union, it could be a number of other things about security, such as common security in relation to how we defend the major police forces against criminal gangs and things like that, trafficking and so on and so forth. There's a whole range of different things. But the people could decide, and there need to be some discussion about this, because the Welsh couldn't decide they were going to do one thing and the Scots another. No one, that might happen, of course. But I think that there's serious discussion and mature discussion. Now, up until fairly recently, the idea of federalism was a kind of Lib Dem anorak thing that folks said, you're bound to think that anyway. But Gordon Brown has recently suggested that we examine it carefully. Murdo Fraser has come out in favour of it in principle, and other politicians. And I know from private discussion, I won't embarrass Andrew, I haven't had this discussion with Andrew, but I have discussed with some folk in SNP who said, if we ended up having a debate about that or independence, then we would sit down and discuss that. We would have a serious discussion about that, because it's one way to take things forward in a non-acrimonious way. There's a lot of countries have federalism. Canada's probably one of the best examples. Australia have a form. Germany has a system where the landers are very, very powerful, and others as well. And where these countries, where it works well. There's a very stable government. 2 minutes, right? Okay, thank you. And it works well. So I think we need to have some discussion about that, and it could end up being part of the healing process. It might be part of the healing process, because I love arguing with my colleagues in the council. We don't argue an awful lot about party politics. We argue quite a bit about things to do with the council, but we don't have a lot of, certainly don't have acrimonious arguments about politics. We have some fun arguments about them, and some serious points are raised. But I think one of the things that you need to be careful about is, even with extra powers, you then end up, and I think where does power lie, you end up, we've got to be careful with not a sort of condependence. And I think one of the examples of this in the independence debate was to keep the Bank of England as the Bank of the Bank of Scotland as well. And I think that developed a potential, if you looked at the ins and outs of it, a condependence situation. I think federalism might well solve some of that, because you decide. Another point I meant to make was, in the tax, you gather the tax, right? The people in the chunks gather the tax and then decide what contribution they're going to make to the central pot, right? Now that needs discussion and negotiation, but that's what Europe's been about for the last umpteen years, about that discussion and arguments. And there would be arguments about it. Let's be honest, some folk would have different priorities. But instead of getting the top-down slicing that you were mentioning, Andrew, and then the same thing could apply, because we're just bring it in, just to finish off, bringing it to the locality, is that we should be raising far more taxation in Perth and Kinross, and then in deciding if there's any left, once Andrew and I have spent all your money, and we could spend it, between us we could spend it all. Like
very thought.
But you then end up saying, well, it would be sensible to have a combined fund for X, Y, or Z. And then you decide, well, you give that to you guys in Holyrood, right? They would obviously keep money for health and things like that. Although there is an argument to more empowerment of local council to do with health and well-being. So I just want to introduce some thoughts to you about federalism, how it works in principle. There are good examples throughout the world, both in Europe and the Western world. There's not quite so many examples in emerging countries, but that may come along as a maturity process. I think it would have the opposite of the top-down, top-slicing process, and it would be part of a healing process that I think could take us forward in the brave new world, which we look forward to.
Anything I say tonight is not to be attributed to the Conservative Party or anything like that, because I'm away out on a limb at the present time as far as their thinking is concerned. I'd just like to say, to back up a lot of what Willie has already said. In 1974, the chairman of the Conservative Party in Perthshire, a chap called Wyn Colville, you may remember him, he set up a group of 8 people to look at the future governance of the country. I happen to be one of those members. I think I'm only one of 2 remaining. The other one's Douglas Davidson, who has all the chemist shops round about. And he set up that group, and we decided that we should have a federal system in the United Kingdom. Why did we decide that? Because we'd had a tranche of new Scottish nationalist members of Parliament. Douglas Crawford had just arrived in this constituency, and we were worried about the future relationships of Scotland and England. We decided they should have a federal system. The House of Lords should be 50% elected, and elected alternatively to Westminster Parliament. That was what we decided in 1974, over 40 years ago. We were totally ignored. I learnt a little poem not so long ago. Denmark seen from foreign land is just but a grain of sand. Denmark, as we Danes conceive it, is so big you won't believe it. Well, I think that's the position we in Britain are finding ourselves at the moment. Because since the turmoil of the first half of the last century, and since various other things that are happening in the world today, we really are a pretty small country from a population size and from an influence size, and yet we're still trying to think that we belong to a great big empire and that we have control over all sorts of things. Well, I'm afraid those days have gone. Today, the US is probably seen as the leader of the world. But cracks are beginning to appear. And we see China and Russia beginning to develop all sorts of relationships in Asia and indeed in the Middle East as well. And soon we will see an empire vanishing like the British Empire has done in the past. The American empire, if you like to call it that at the present time, seems to be diminishing, and we're going to see the rise of alternative empires or leaders of the world. I think we need to be part of that. I think we need to be part of Europe to have any clout whatsoever. Here at home, as Willie has said quite correctly, we are a centralised government. We have inherited an ancient form of governance that's been handed down since the uninterrupted legacy of absolute monarchs and kings who controlled absolutely everything from the centre. And in the last 20 years, we have had 22 small ad hoc modifications to our arrangements, our governing arrangements. Constitutional change only comes when you've got real power and a strong government. And I have to say that if you look at the system that we have got, we've been tinkering with it rather than actually addressing some of the main problems that we should be looking at. as Willie says, to try and bring everybody back together again rather than being divided. We entrust the life of our nation to a few offices of state, and we pray for the occupants who hold those that they're going to look after us properly. If the government is weak, or even if the government is strong but wrong, there is nothing that we can do about it. And that, I think, is a fundamental lack of democracy that we have in our system at the present time. The loss of EU membership, I think, will actually cause a greater centralisation of power in London, because some of the powers that are held in Brussels at the moment, which have been devolved to Brussels willingly, are going to be repatriated here, and that'll give central government in this country even more control than they have at the present time. So we've got to be careful of that. Historically, we should not forget that it was Ted Heath's government that started the political movement towards devolution for Scotland. And you may not all remember, but some of you are far too young to remember, that it was actually the Declaration of Perth that started devolution, getting on to the thinking process of the politicians in this country. Sir Alec Douglas Hume was appointed to look at a committee for devolution for Scotland. His main criteria were to keep the United Kingdom united, to improve the machinery of government for Scotland, to allow Scots a proper say on legislation affecting Scotland, and to provide a Scottish voice on UK policy as it affected Scotland in the United Kingdom. Ted Heath, unfortunately, was never allowed to deliver that because he was defeated in an election. Harold Wilson carried it on and appointed a royal commission to look at the governance of Scotland, and it was Tony Blair, who had a big majority, who was actually able to deliver it in 1997. Now, most democratic countries have codified balances one way or another. You have this set off against that. And if you actually look at it, you find in America, France, and Germany, they are all fairly democratic, where the people have quite a lot of say and can do something about their government. Thomas Jefferson, who was president in 1801 to 1809, said, "Democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of 49% of the people." Well, just look at what happened in the referendum, and you'll find that 48% certainly wanted to remain, but 26% did not vote. And so you have got a total of 64% of people in this country that did not support Brexit. And I think that is something that Theresa May is totally ignoring at the present time. America is designed to prosper despite its politics. A president whose party is in power in the legislature has also got the Congress to contend with, so they have got a balance within the decision-making process. And they've also got 50 states that they have got to take into consideration and consult if they want to get anything through at the federal level. In France, what centralisation there is only goes back as 1958, when Charles de Gaulle came into power and really had to pull the country together. But they have got strong organisations within their parliament. They have got other organisations like in the Fifth Republic, like extra-parliamentary actors such as trade unions, and a hugely strong bureaucratic class as well. And all these have got to be challenged along with the local mayors that they have in all their major areas of France. Germany is a democratic federal system with a parliamentary republic, with a parliament, which is called the Bundestag, and then you've got the Bundesrat, as Willie mentioned, which is the Länder, where they come together, and you've got a balance there to achieve if you want to do anything. So that's the people voting in the local areas that have a voice in the national parliament. Democratic constitutional reform should be viewed as a way in the future of a hedge against bad government. If any good comes of the current rolling fiasco that we seem to be in this country, it'll be a resolve to the nation's exposure to the central government system that we have at the present time. The country that can least afford to get its politics wrong is getting its politics wrong at the present time. Now, you cannot reform Parliament and change the way the country works without having a strong government. The current system, however, is centralised, and the national government decides and controls nearly everything. Civilised government works best, as Willie said, from the bottom up. And that is the important issue that I think we have all got to try and agree on. The local level is actually the most important, then through devolved parliaments to a national federal government. And in the current circumstances, I believe we should at least be thinking about a federalised Europe and not just necessarily a Europe of nation states. Central government should be domestically, just be responsible for setting minimum standards and controlling them, but look after internal and external defence and foreign affairs. National tax, therefore, should be low to pay just for those national activities, with local taxes being administered at local level. That way, people would be closer to the decisions that concern their daily lives.
Good evening. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Andrew asked me some weeks ago and I foolishly said yes, so now I'm on the spot. Thank you. The first thing I wanted to look at was where should power lie? Well, yes, as two speakers have said already, power should lie with the people. And I suppose my starting point is that I believe in our current circumstances, we have very bad systems, and I think it's been alluded to already, for, if you like, transferring the power of the people to institutions that govern us, that represent us. First past the post. That to me is an abomination. We have it at the UK level. We don't have it at other levels, thank goodness. I'm actually not a fan, particularly, of STV. I much prefer the Scottish Parliament system. I think STV tends to limit the number of people that stand and come forward, and too high a percentage of those that stand get elected. It doesn't encourage competition. So we have poor electoral systems in part. We also have no written constitution. I'm afraid I'm a fan of a written constitution, but yes, we've seen where I believe a written constitution in Spain can go wrong. So a written constitution has got to be constructed carefully, but I think that a written constitution provides that rule book for our elected representatives at whatever level they are at. It provides a framework within which they can operate. My perception of the UK system is that our representatives, once elected, have a free hand. And I think part of that feeds into the fix we find ourselves with the European Union at the moment, because part of the issue surely is that in the past, perhaps too many of our elected representatives have been prepared to give up power beyond what the British people have wanted, rather than wield power on their behalf. And I think that's part of the problem with where we got to. And I'd also say that I'm a fan of referenda. I would love to live in an environment like Switzerland, where you can have referenda at different levels of government for different things, as a routine part of participative democracy. But again, you have to have rules and regulations for them. I think that the referenda that we've had in Scotland have been so divisive because they're seen as unusual, they're seen as different. There is no process that really ingrains them in our society. So I suppose my starting point where power should lie is that the UK to me is certainly a flawed democracy and we could do better. But I still think it's a democracy where any outcome is possible, but it might be happening more by accident than judgment. Certainly the Spanish example to me at the moment is a managed democracy. Certain outcomes are essentially not available. It's interesting looking at constitutions. When I took this on, I thought, and you start getting into things in a lot of detail. Liechtenstein is a tiny little country, but each of the 11 communes in Liechtenstein has the right of secession in their constitution from Liechtenstein. Okay, I think it's probably true to say sovereign states are the traditional building blocks of the international order. And I don't see that changing any time soon. They exercise control over their territory and over their borders. They hold power over their territory and their population, limited only by the potential for intervention from other states. But as we've seen in a variety of circumstances in recent years, the willingness of sovereign states to interfere for good or bad in the other affairs of other sovereign states, however well or badly they're seen to be doing, is very limited, even in the modern world, and probably rightly so. I suppose the traditional role of sovereign states, keeping the population free from fear and free from want. Some states do better than others at that. And also, traditionally, and I think it's still true today, sovereign states are the monopoly owners of force in the modern world. Although, again, that's not always true. Scotland has a second army. We have the Duke of Athol's regiment, by constant an army. And Malaysia, the state of Johor, joined the Malaysian Federation only on condition that the Sultan of Johor could keep his state defence force. It's 5,000 strong. That's more than a band and a ceremonial guard. So the states are the building blocks of the modern world. Before I go on to, if you like, looking at higher levels and lower levels and why, just a word about autonomous entities, of which I think Scotland is one. You look around the world and you look at all of the parts of sovereign states that have different arrangements than are made for other parts of those states that are merely regional administrations or whatever. And I think as you look around the world, it becomes apparent that most autonomous entities are efforts in one way or another to keep a lid on a boiling pot or stuff the worms back into the can, in one way or another. These days, those reasons may have moved on. I think the Åland Islands, which were very controversial at the end of the First World War, are entirely happy with their situation now, but I think they'd be extremely upset if the Finns or the Swedes tried to change anything about that arrangement. For one thing, the Åland Islanders are the only Finns who don't have conscription and never have had. So autonomous entities are another area of how and why power is wielded, but I think that it comes across to me that they are ways of addressing problems for the sovereign states that they're part of. Going on to international entities, of which the European Union is one. To me, it's all about, if the sovereign states hold the power, that they are, all international entities are manifestations of a desire to share or pool resources or power. And I'm always struck by the fact that too often in our own context, we look at NATO as being the international entity that has kept the peace. Yes, NATO kept the peace throughout the Cold War, what it was designed for. It then went in for a bit of global globetrotting. I think with recent events in Russia and the East, NATO is focusing more on its traditional tasks. But I look at the European Union, and that too is far more of, if you like, a security organization than many people give it credit for. It came, what we have today, came out of the European Iron and Steel Committee, I think it was, which was essentially to stop Western Europeans fighting each other. And that is still important, because ideology, religion, can be, as we know, a major source of conflict. But beyond that, resource shortages, resource issues are a major source of conflict. And ultimately, the EU manifests its security, if you like, not through military power, but through all of those now very complex arrangements that govern a largely successful trading organization and a social enterprise that keeps initially Western Europe, but now a much bigger area of Europe, secure and at peace. We have other international entities. The UN by itself. Many people criticize the UN for a lack of action or a lack of drive. But it's interesting that nearly every single sovereign state in the world chooses to belong to it, so it must have some use. And the UN has given rise to a lot of other organizations in functional areas, like the World Health Organization. And I think, again, it's all part of the pooling and sharing. Up until the First World War, certainly, possibly the Second World War, the movement of populations was massively smaller than it is now. But the World Health Organization, to deal with health issues on a global scale, when these days Ebola can fly from one country to another as fast as a 747 can fly, rather than 6 weeks on the boat from Africa, yet to me, it has a vital role dealing with health issues, environmental issues, climate issues on a scale larger than the nation. And that is the reason why some states, most states, choose to pool and share power with supranational entities for their benefit and the benefit of those around them. We come on to what we sort of, I think, mistakenly call local government. I'm afraid I veer towards the Leslie Riddoch tendency on local government. We don't have, and this is me speaking, I don't believe we have local government in Scotland. We have regional administration. Exactly the point that has already been made in terms of, I think Willie made it, taxation. I believe that at a regional level or a more local level, we should raise a lot more of the money that we spend so that we are truly accountable for the functions that are conducted at this level. The only balance there should be on that, from my perspective, is a balance that makes sure that the wealthy areas of the country are not, if you like, doing so much better than the much poorer areas of the country. That there is a leavening across the piece. But I would certainly like to see a system where a lot more of the funds that pay for our local government to make it truly local government are raised locally. And I suppose I came back to Perth now 6 years ago, and in England they still do have, if you like, local government in a way that we don't here. I lived north of Marlborough for a number of years. The parish council there has statutory responsibilities, and it can impose a levy on the council tax. I think I'm still right in saying that. It's, our council tax bill there had Wiltshire's bit of the council tax and the parish levy for conducting, carrying out those statutory responsibilities that they had. And I think that the situation we find ourselves here, I don't know what Willie's experience of it is, but other councillors see the community councils that we have here as an encumbrance because they're just talking shops. I would love to see our community councils given teeth, given some sort of tax-raising power to exercise certain responsibilities. Because I think many things can be done much better locally. But I think we have to caution against a couple of things. The first is the postcode lottery, which my understanding of it is meant to say everyone gets exactly the same treatment, whether it's health or other things, wherever they live. I think if you accept systems where there is more tax-raising power at local community level, and there's a genuine ability to make decisions at the local level, you have to accept that there may be differences, big differences, between the provision in one area and the provision in another area. But if that reflects the local will of those people, then I think that's fair. I'm being wound up. Can I just say one more thing? Another area that, in where power should lie, I've alluded to the use of force. Given my background, force is of interest to me. And again, in terms of where should power lie, I think there are very interesting discussions still to be had in the United Kingdom and Scotland about the use of military force. Who does actually authorise it and allow it to be done? My experience in the UK is if the MOD hasn't already started planning for something, when politicians come asking, they're criticised for it. In Sweden, it is absolutely forbidden for the military to start looking at anything until they have parliamentary sanction for it. And I think that's another thing that we should be considering in this whole business of where power lies.
The people have spoken, or 37% of them did. Enemies of the people, that's you and me, according to the Daily Mail. Unelected bureaucrats, Portillo, Redwood, St Martin and Wetherspoons, constantly demonising those unelected bureaucrats that apparently run us all from Europe. But I believe what spurs on the Brexiteers to get back control at any cost is the feeling in Westminster, in Whitehall and Fleet Street that power, influence and relevance has been drifting away from them to where the power increasingly actually lies these days. And this is only compounded that the squeeze from above, as they see it from the EU, is matched by the squeeze from below, from Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. MPs find themselves vying with councillors about leaks in council house roofs, potholes in their constituency roads and streets, while they feel powerless over the big issues which they see as being decided away in Brussels. And as to democracy, as we've been hearing, the councils are elected by PR, the Scottish Parliament is elected by PR, the European Parliament is elected by PR, the House of Commons is elected first past the post, an undemocratic system which throws up, in many cases, very bizarre results. The House of Lords isn't even elected. And our wonderful head of state, wonderful in every respect, but not exactly democratically elected. Oh, but no one knows who is their MEP. And who on earth ever bothers to vote in European elections? Well, why is that? In my view, it's MPs, London-centric journalists, have made a point of ignoring how the EU works, shutting out the EP, the European Parliament, from any significant media coverage, unless a scandal or some xenophonic aspersion can be found to denigrate both the European Union and the European Parliament. There is not a single Scottish journalist resident in Brussels, and the precious few British ones. I think there's only about one, unless they troop in for a day to cover a Council of Ministers meeting, trailing Mrs. May, relying on the British government for their briefings, which are inevitably lopsided, self-seeking, quickly board the Eurostar and get back to comfy old London. Do they ever consider and cover the vitally important legislation which is passing through the European Parliament, and where our elected MEPs debate and actually use their votes to decide matters that are of importance to their readers and in their constituencies? No, their readers will only know of these issues if later at home there are objections and it is still blamed on nasty old Europe, deciding things we don't like without us apparently having any chance to get it right. Every piece of EU legislation is passed through the House of Commons and the House of Lords for scrutiny, and they even have a yellow card system to object to them. But while the unelected House of Lords does often provide an intelligent, useful critique, the House of Commons can't be bothered and just goes on moaning about Europe. Every British voter has had the means to choose the person to represent their interests at their European elections. Do they use that vote? Did they lobby their MEP on any subject? Probably they didn't even know that they could or how they could. For lack of information, for misinformation, for misunderstandings of how the system works, of how decisions are actually made, and yes, where the power actually does lie. And even if we do depart the EU, you can be quite sure that the decisions about rules and regulations, about laws and standards that come out of the EU and through the European Parliament will still have major relevance for the Britain and for us in Britain, even for those little Englanders who are so concerned to get back control. The only difference, and the problem is, we will no longer have representatives debating and voting in the Parliament. We will no longer have ministers debating and voting in the Council of Ministers. The EU will still determine our standards, our rules and regulations, without us having any say, and that place where nearly half our trade is concentrated and is critical to our economic well-being, our jobs and our futures. I have to admit, and I've kept quiet about it often, but sometimes people would say to me, as an MEP, surely we have too many layers of government. Can't we rationalise it all a bit? Brussels, Westminster, Edinburgh, Perth. Think it out. The global issues, global trade and economics, global peace and security, climate, world poverty, the oceans, etc., etc. They look to Brussels or London. The national issues, education, health services, transport, look to Edinburgh or London. The local issues, schools, roads and potholes, rubbish collection, local planning approvals, look to Perth. Immediately you see the squeeze on London. Currently they are left primarily responsible for foreign policy and defence. And this is why London, that is Westminster MPs, have been so negative about the EU's role in foreign policy and the role of the foreign policy supremo, who first was Lady Ashton, is now an Italian, Federica Mogherini. These are the people to whom Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, now Mr. Tillerson of the United States, Secretary of State, have referred first, do refer, and will refer when they're discussing the Middle East, or Israel and Palestine, or Syria,
the Iranian Treaty, all those other major international issues. Sure, national foreign ministers have had a role, but it is becoming a reduced one and a lesser role since the position of an EU High Representative was established, and has given the American Secretary of State that single telephone number which Avril Harriman used to lament for. Nowadays there are EU embassies in all the capitals of the world, and it is they which actively coordinate the embassies of the member states. And this is why the mere thought of a European army also sends Westminster MPs into a state of apoplexy. After Brexit, it looks increasingly likely that a significant military role for the EU will develop. Up to now, the UK has been one of the holders back, but already there have been instances of naval patrols against Somali pirates, combined naval operations to rescue migrants in the Mediterranean, humanitarian operations, peacekeeping missions in Africa and the Balkans. I think Andrew's been involved in some of these around Europe and around the world. Yesterday, the 13th November 2017, a significant date, 23 EU member states met in Brussels to coordinate defence and to agree on common standards for defence equipment. We Brits excluded ourselves and will be excluded from the defence equipment contracts which will result from this. NATO still brings together a somewhat different group of countries, including, importantly of course, the USA and Canada. But the EU is bound now to play an increasing role in coordinating the EU members of NATO, both for operations within NATO and separately out with NATO. This is accentuated and emphasised by the fact that Mr. Trump in America tends to be withdrawing into his shell. And clearly this grouping, with nuclear power France at the head, and Germany's money, will come to dominate NATO alongside the Americans. And us defence cuts, Britain, will still be relevant, but diminished in the defence role, as in foreign policy, as in global trade policies, and in so many areas of the highest importance to us and to our children and our grandchildren. It looks to me more than likely that far from enhancing Britain's influence and role in the world, Brexit will diminish it. We will lie in all those areas somewhere between America and Europe. Honest broker? I doubt it. More like pig in the middle and doing what we're told. And is that taking back control? The power was increasingly moving to Brussels, Edinburgh and Perth. Brexit will appear for a transitory period of wishful thinking to return it to London, Edinburgh and Perth. But it's an illusion. We will have no option but to align with Brussels or Washington. With Mr. Trump in DC, I sincerely hope and suspect it'll be Brussels rather than Washington. But how sad if we are not inside, influencing, debating, voting, deciding what the EU does, instead of just reacting and following along, complaining, grumbling, but inevitably going along. In this sad situation, which is inevitable for us in our future, not quite yet. There is just that glimmer, that chink in the darkness, that we could pull back from the brink. It will take determination. It will take courage to stand up against an increasingly desperate and vicious Brexit brigade of media, politicians and trolls. It will take courage, especially among those MPs, Conservative and Labour in particular, who know in their hearts and brains what is really right for their constituents and our country, and for particularly our young people. It can still be done, but it is up to us, and let's set about it.